I was born and raised in Arizona. I come from a hunting family. Every fall during opening weekend of deer season, my family went up to the Mogollon Rim. This is where we always put up for our deer tags. As a child, my uncle would tease me about having to sleep in the deer carcass if I was bad and things like that. He also told me about the Mongolian monster. I always thought he was just teasing me until I saw for myself. I was about 7 and my older brother was 10, and rather than sleep in a tent like the other adults, my mother wanted us to sleep in the old Ford window van, so we would be warmer as the night temps would drop below freezing. Before bed, the van would be started and the heater turned on so it was nice and warm for bed. The van was at least 6.5 feet high at the roof, so there was room for me to stand up in. One night I didn't hear any adults, so I was a bit confused. I started to sit up when a shadow passed the window of the van and stopped by the side of it. It was on my side of the van, and I can see something covered in fur standing by the window. At first I thought it was a bear, but the dogs usually bark when a bear comes near camp. I could see from the stomach to the chest of whatever this was, but not the arms or the legs. Just about this time, I heard something on the roof of the van like something was reaching across it or touching it, so I thought it had to be my uncle messing with me, and covered my head and went back to sleep. In the morning, I told my brother that Uncle Mike was messing with me last night and explained what had happened. My brother opens the van door and calls for our uncle and excitedly tells him what I said. They then look around the van and find footprints that were huge, and handprints on the roof of the van. There had been something there, and it was not Mike. It was not until years later I figured out that the Mongolian monster was the local name for Bigfoot. After that year, I slept with the grandparents in the travel trailer. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in my younger years. It was a great experience, and any young college grad in the US who is interested, I encourage to follow through and apply. One of the best decisions I've ever made. Anyway, I was posted in southern Africa into a small village in the more or less center of the Kalahari Desert. They call it there the Kagalagadi. Out there in the bushveld, it was easy to feel really isolated. There was no Americans in the village I lived in, and the only English speakers really were my teacher colleagues at the junior high. I had learned the national language more or less pretty well from the 14 weeks of training, but the dialect of my post was such that it wasn't really easily understandable. Think as if you learned standard American English then move into the Appalachian Hills, that kind of difference. The Kalahari Desert, you need to know, isn't a true desert in the sense that it's not the rolling wasteland of sand like the Sahel or the Sahara, or the vast deserts in the bordering Namibia. The Kalahari has trees, shepherd trees, thorny bushes, short hard-barked rough trees that can survive without rain for long periods. I mention this for what comes later. Anyway, I am sort of given to melancholy if I have too much time on my hands. This is just my character, so in those days, I would sometimes move a sitting room chair from my little school-provided house, or hut, out into my yard in the evening and look at the stars. The stars were too numerous to believe out there removed from any nearby city. No electric light as the school compound diesel-powered generator was shut off around 8. So one night I'm sitting there sort of basking in my introversities, half hoping someone will happen by me and join me, and something catches my eye out in the bush. The bush was usually just a dark mass. It began several hundred yards out from my house, which as I say was on the school compound. The land for the school had long ago been cleared of trees, but right where they stopped clearing, the wild began again. Nothing was ever out there. I saw big snakes from time to time. Since they were technically on school grounds, I always killed them with a shovel. The local folk freaked out at snakes. Other than that, the fauna kept clear of us. And the most troublesome creatures were scorpions and my nemesis, the camel spiders that ran around in the late afternoon and evening. My point here is that I wasn't used to seeing movement out in the bush, and what was even stranger was that this thing seemed to be glowing, like fire, but it was moving very fast and steady, not like someone running with a burning torch or something, but like a crackly fiery object about as big as a campfire, but traveling at speed about chest level, obscured now and again by an intervening tree. Suddenly very alert, I watched it for as long as it was visible. The urge to tell someone was of course great, but as I say, there was simply no one else around. My reporting of this would be the next day. after I had slept the night sort of forgetting about it. I mentioned offhandedly what I had seen to my neighbor, a woman home ec teacher maybe a year or two older than I, who went to bed early. She was a native, for lack of a better word. African, though not from the village. She considered the locals to be rather simple hicks, but she became very quiet when I told the story, as if I were telling her something unseemly, or thrown open a door onto an embarrassing sight. It was clear she wanted me to shut up. After a moment and what seemed like considerable effort, she told me that this was how witches traveled. She spoke English and used the English word witch, and that it was considered an ill omen to see. Around that same month, me and some other teachers hooked up to the school TV VHS to a battery and watched a Stallone film, Cobra, I think. And while we were there at the school, there was a freak rainstorm with thunder and lightning. When the video finished and we emerged to go home, someone was running up to us calling my name. Lightning had struck my house, tearing part of the roof off and sending a sheet of corrugated metal onto my bed. Anyway, I got lucky. It was very weird, though. About 7 years ago in Sierra Vista, a little city in Arizona about 15 minutes from the Mexican border, misfortune had hit hard, and I had been homeless for about 6 months at that point. So the usual schedule for me was to be awake until sunrise. The nights were cold and staying moving kept me warm. At the first rays of sunlight were so warm that I was able to sleep. I would only sleep for a little bit before I was back up and hitting a local charity for lunch, catnap through dinner, wake up back as the sun goes down and wander through the desert to stay warm until sunrise. I run you through my schedule so that you know this thing happened during my normal operating hours, while I was fully awake. It's not possible that it was a dream, and not likely to be in my imagination. So I had two routes. During the day, I would be in town, so I would be unarmed. But I had a straight-edged sword back in my burrow that I had bought when I had a job and a car and a house. During the night, I wandered the desert, and would be often exploring far enough out that I could no longer even see the lights in town. So I would wear my sword sheathed on my back, a just-in-case measure, and I'd really only ever use it to carve up yucca stalks for the roof of my burrow. Okay, setup complete. Here's what I saw. I'm walking along, following the edge of a small wash, twirling a stick I found. I'd walked for about an hour to get there, so I was probably a good 5 or so miles from any human on the planet. I hear a thump from ahead. But there's some scuffy bushes ahead, so I can't see anything. Not wanting to sneak up on something dangerous like a mother javelina or a bear, I take my stick and smack the nearest tree a couple times. Thumping stops, and about 30 feet ahead of me, I see a head poke up from behind a bush. A head I've seen before, kinda. It had big eyes and tufty bits on it, and was basically set up like any other primate face. But it also kinda looked reptilian. So I did what any normal person would do, and grabbed my sword handle and yanked it. Well, it didn't really work like that. I yanked it forward and accidentally broke the strap that kept the sheath on my back. So here I am, brandishing a sheathed sword at a lizard monkey, 5 miles from nowhere, and it stands up to full height of 4 feet. And Usain bolts itself away from me with this ostrich person gait that was more awkward to watch than it was scary. I went back to my burrow. I saw a humanoid something in the woods outside my childhood home. This was rural northern Wisconsin, and I was 14. Up until that day, I had zero fear of the woods. I spent most of my time out there exploring and feared nothing. My parents had a lousy marriage and fought a lot, and I felt more at home outside than in my own house. On hot nights, I'd take a sleeping bag and sleep on the roof of an old shack on our property. I saw bears, I saw wolves. They were always more afraid of me than them. I didn't believe in ghosts, Bigfoot, demons, or even God. I only got lost out there once when dark fell sooner than I expected. I stayed calm, found the North Star, and knew that if I continued south, I'd eventually come across the old railroad tracks near my house. Even though the thought of spending the night out there didn't bother me, the thought of my mom's rage when I didn't come home did. So it was summer, I had just turned 14. My mom had left my father. Father worked all the time. Sister was living on her own. Once school was out, it was me and my cat and this, before the internet or smartphones. We lived on a dead-end dirt road, and around noon I took my usual stroll down the long driveway to check the mail. My cat followed me everywhere, and I actually kind of relied on him to give me a heads up if there was a bear or something close by. A bit of movement behind me as I stood at the mailbox made me aware there was something across the road in the trees, but there were pesky deer everywhere. I heard a loud crash then, like something very loud making its way through the brush. It's like every goddamn classic horror story. My brain had no capability for the thought of anything paranormal or spooky. I simply tucked the mail under my arm and headed into the woods to investigate. My cat followed close behind. I got about 10 yards in when I noticed what I hadn't noticed before. There was no noise. Nothing. It was a beautiful June day and there wasn't a single bird singing, no insects, no leaves rustling. It was absolutely silent. At the same time I registered the silence, I got that eerie feeling that something was watching me. I stopped immediately and started scanning the woods for deer. Hunters know what I'm talking about when I say you look for the shape of a deer instead of trying to pinpoint them by color. And that's when I spotted it. 2 brown furry legs, the top of it concealed by tree branches. I went to sigh with relief when my cat hissed. I looked down and he was completely poofed out with his back arched, looking at the same thing I was. I looked back up and the legs moved, not like a deer, like a human. Everything happened at once after that. I dropped the mail, picked up my cat by the scruff and ran for it. Whatever was out there with me was running after me. I've never run so fast in my life. I tore up the driveway into the house and locked the door and grabbed the phone. I called my next door neighbor who was the ex-chief of police, and he came over immediately with his pistol. He checked out the spot I was in and found nothing. I was so hysterical I was in tears. He stayed with me until I was able to reach my mom and have her come get me. Of course they thought I was completely high or delusional. I know exactly what I saw and felt. It was broad daylight. I never felt safe in those woods again, and I stopped sleeping outside.